or now. I do not trust Apple. Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. I wanted to welcome everybody. I'm going to take a step back. I'm very loud and I don't want to, me and a mic is a bad combination. I'm Dr. Anderson. I'm one of the co-chairs of the Civil Rights Conference, and we are happy today to introduce one of our speakers. Mr. Tim Wise is among the most prominent anti-racist writers and educators in the United States. He has spent the past 26 years speaking to audiences in all 50 states and over 1,500 colleges and high school campuses, at hundreds of professional academic conferences and to community groups across the country. Mr. Wise has also trained corporate, government, entertainment, media, law enforcement, military, and medical industry professionals on methods for dismantling racial inequality in their institutions, and has provided anti-racism training to educators and administrators nationwide and internationally. Mr. Wise is the author of 9 books, including his latest essay collection, Dispatches from the Race War, that is available for sale after this, and Mr. Wise is kind enough to be doing a book signing for us. And the highly acclaimed memoir, White Like Me, Reflections on Race from a Privileged Son. From 1999 to 2003, Mr. Wise was an advisor to Fisk University's Race Relation Institute in Nashville, and in the early 90s, he was the youth coordinator and associate director of the Louisiana Coalition Against Racism and Nazism. Mr. Wise has been featured in several documentaries, including White Like Me, Race, Racism, and White Privilege in America, and The Great White Hoax, Donald Trump and the Politics of Race and Class in America. Mr. Wise appears regularly on CNN and MSNBC to discuss race issues, and has been featured on other shows such as Nightline, CBS Sunday Morning, 2020, and 48 Hours. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Tim Wise.
Thank you. Thank you very much. First off, I want to congratulate the hardy souls who actually, came out in this weather. I know it's a little dreary out, it's a little chilly out, and you have the option in this day and age of not coming out and just watching this on YouTube, which I almost felt like I would just stay in the hotel and give the speech on YouTube. So I'm amazed that you came out. I'm sort of amazed that I did. So we're here, and I appreciate you being here. And for those of you who didn't make the trek, absolutely fine, understandable, sitting around, enjoy the program in your dorm or apartment or home, wherever you're watching it. And for those who get to see it afterward, I assume it'll be archived. I hope you enjoyed as well. It is an honor to be able to come and talk to you. It would be at any time about these issues of racial equity and racial justice in America, but it is especially important, I think, that I do this now, and that this particular month of events that I know you've been having here at UT Martin has been happening at a really important time for this conversation to take place. It is both an exciting but also an incredibly dangerous moment in the history of our country when it comes to the subject matter of race and racism. Exciting for obvious reasons, because in the last couple of years we have been in the midst of what is really the largest sustained racial justice uprising in American history, just in terms of the raw numbers of people involved in racial justice work of some type or another. I'm not just talking about protest activity in the wake of the murder of George Floyd, though I am talking about that. I'm also talking about the way that in the wake of that killing, and especially in the first 6 months to a year after that, you had millions of people in schools across the country, in corporate America across the country, in state agencies and federal agencies and local government agencies and nonprofit groups, churches, synagogues, mosques, etc., really taking up this issue in ways that many of them had never done before. Obviously, there were some who had been on this subject for many, many years, decades, their entire lives, but there were millions of folks, especially those of us called white in this country, who after the killing of George Floyd sort of had the veil lifted from our eyes a little bit about the reality of injustice in this country, particularly as regards policing, but then that sort of snowballed into conversations about equity and injustice in the workplace, equity and injustice in schools, equity and injustice in housing, in wealth accumulation, and all the different arenas of human activity. And so that's the exciting piece, that was happening, and the narrative began to change, right? We saw within a few months of the beginning of that uprising terms like systemic racism being used on mainstream media programs. I assure you, having done this work for 30 years, that was something new, right? The term systemic racism was not something that you would hear on ABC, NBC, CBS, even CNN and MSNBC, where I appear. Very rarely would you hear those terms used. You weren't hearing those terms bandied about in corporate boardrooms or in most classrooms. The same with the term white privilege, something we'll talk a little bit about this evening as well. When that term started to be heard in mainstream media, I knew something was happening, right? These are concepts that we've talked about in the academic and activist communities for a long time. But I remember several years ago, the first time I heard it, actually, Bill O'Reilly still had a show. He was still relevant. So I know that's been a minute. But back in the day when Bill O'Reilly was still relevant and had a show, I remember he did a program where he spent 3 days in a row trying to debunk the idea of white privilege. Which is sort of funny, right? Like, why would you spend 3 days trying to debunk something that isn't real? Like, that just seems like a waste of time, right? Like, if I were to come to you and say, there is a Tyrannosaurus Rex rampaging down the middle of Times Square right now, Bill, what do you have to say? I don't think he'd spend 3 days trying to disprove it, right? It would be like a 2-minute thing. It'd be like, no, there's not, and that's stupid. Right? So when you spend 3 days trying to debunk something, you're sort of telling on yourself, right? You're sort of acknowledging like, I don't think I debunked it that first time, I better try again. And he tried it again, he's like, yeah, I still haven't gotten it right, let me try one more time. And that's when I knew that the racial justice work that many of us have been engaged in was starting to penetrate. Didn't mean everybody was on the same page, which is fine. Didn't mean that everybody was going to agree with the concept, but at least the term was being heard. The narrative was beginning to shift. Same thing with the term systemic racism. But then came the danger part, and it was all very predictable. But I think some of the folks who were new to this work maybe weren't prepared for it, right? Because all these new folks joined the movement thinking there was going to be change happen in a really dramatic and relatively fast fashion because the movement grew so quickly, right? And if you're new to it, you don't realize how long-term this work is. And so you get expectations way up here about what's going to happen and when it's going to happen. And then 6 months go by and 9 months go by and a year goes by. And there hadn't been that much, if anything, that's sort of fundamentally changed. And people get burned out and they get cynical and they get skeptical about the prospects for change. And then in that moment, that nadir, that sort of diminution of activism, comes the backlash that we all knew was coming. Right? Because Carol Anderson told us it would come if we didn't already know. Brilliant scholar at Emory University, who in her book White Rage proves historically how in every era of American history, every step forward for black people in particular, you could say people of color generally, but certainly for black folks, every step forward, every bit of progress has been met with a concomitant backlash of white rage. It happened after abolition, right? And when Reconstruction was destroyed in the South, it happened in the wake of the Great Migration, when black folks started moving to the Midwest and the North and out West for better jobs beginning in the 19-teens and 1920s, met with violence, met with overt acts of bigotry as a form of backlash to that progress. It happened in the wake of desegregation, obviously. It happened in the wake of civil rights laws in the 1960s. It happened again in the wake of affirmative action programs. It happened in the aftermath of the Obama election, even though that election didn't really materially change very much for black people in this country. I mean, systemically, not that much change, but that was a huge symbolic step forward in black America, right? To actually have the head of state be someone that looked fundamentally different and had a fundamentally different backstory than every president before him shook some people up. That's why they couldn't get it through their head that he was even American, right? That's why they had to continually ask him for his papers the way we do folks coming over the southern border, right? Just to prove that you really belong here in this house. Like, you got to prove Ahmaud Arbery belongs in that neighborhood, and you, Barack Obama, you got to prove that you belong in that house called white, right? And so that backlash came in the aftermath of the Obama election, and then again in the aftermath of the uprising, even though not that much has changed fundamentally in policing since that uprising, if anything, right? But the narrative progress is real, right? When those terms start to be used and understood, and when you've got millions of young people entering the movement. See, that scares certain folks, right, who would rather keep the lid on things and keep things sort of the way they are. When you start having young people, especially young white people, joining this movement in solidarity with black and brown peoples, that is quite dangerous. They expect black folks to complain about injustice because black folks been complaining about injustice for 400 years. They sort of know how to manage that, or they think they do. But when you have white folks actually joining that as well, as tens of millions of young white folks did in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd, all of a sudden the backlash became especially necessary. Right? That's why all of a sudden they're attacking critical race theory, which, by the way, they could not define if I were to put a gun to their heads and ask them to define it and tell them that if they got it wrong, I would kill them. They would all, and I'm not a violent person, so I'm not actually fantasizing about this scenario. I'm just letting you know that they would all die. All the people that are attacking it who have absolutely no idea what it is and can't be bothered to actually look it up. I mean, these are people who managed to research every fake COVID cure known to man. They'll listen to their cousin Jimmy on Facebook. They'll get on Reddit and listen to Chia Mama 417 explain how, iodine will cure COVID and how you can just like colloidal silver will get rid of cancer. They can find all that, but they can't Google critical race theory, apparently. Right? So go figure, right? But that's another kind of backlash, another kind of rage. You attack these ideas. Why now? Critical race theory was created in the late 70s and early 1980s, and no one said anything about it, right? No one really cared outside of sort of picayune debates in law schools, which is where critical race theory is principally applied. So why would all of a sudden it become necessary to attack critical race theory? Because the timing coincides with this uprising, and the idea is to shut down any conversation about racial injustice in America. Because you don't want those white folks to become allies. You don't want those white folks to act in solidarity. You don't want them to learn the truth about the history of the country. And you say it's because you're trying to protect their feelings. That's what they say, right? We don't want white folks to feel bad about being white. Nobody's trying to make anybody feel bad about being white. But if that is your concern, there's a really easy solution. Teach about some different white people. Right? If you're feeling guilty about white folks, and maybe you just need to focus a little less on Andrew Jackson and a little bit more on people like Jeremiah Everts, who was a white man who's one of his principal opponents to indigenous removal. Because there were white folks who stood up against that mess. There were white folks who joined the abolitionist struggle, whose names we don't know. Lydia Marie Child, the Grimke sisters, John Fee, an abolitionist preacher who was defrocked from his church by the Presbyterian Synod because he refused to minister to slaveholders, founded Berea College in Kentucky. Right? Why don't we know these people's names? Why don't we teach these white anti-racist allies who acted in solidarity with black peoples? Right? Because if you're concerned that anti-racists like me are trying to make white people feel bad about being white, and I'm telling you, no, there are these other role models that we could have, why don't you want to teach about them? That would be the solution to white guilt, right? You don't have to feel guilt and shame when you know you got a choice to make. And here are these examples of people who made that choice. Joan Trump-Auer Mulholland in the civil rights struggle, Bob and Dottie Zellner, Connie Curry, Virginia Foster Durr. Like I could go down this list, all these names of people who have fought. Some of them died for the cause of racial equity. There haven't been enough of us. I mean, there have been enough who've died, don't get me wrong, I didn't mean it that way. But there haven't been enough of us who joined in solidarity, but we've always been there. Why don't we learn about those folks in school, see? The people that attack critical race theory don't talk about doing that. They don't want that taught. They just don't want race talked about at all. They don't want us to deal with what's real. And that backlash now is dividing our country even more than it already was. And we have to figure out collectively how to push through that. And those of us who are white in particular are going to have to become very clear on why it's so important to engage this conversation, even with our children in those early grades. I have a 20 and an 18-year-old now, but we started talking about race with them, I did in particular, when they were very young, watching Disney films. You can talk about race and class and gender while kids are watching the media that kids consume, because there are subtle messages about all three of those things being delivered every single day in the movies and the television that they ingest, right? And the video games that they play and the videos that they watch on YouTube and the advertising, the marketing that's done to children. Done to their parents, but through their children, right? So it's never too young to start talking about these things. We have so many folks in this country, though, that are afraid. They don't know how to do it well, so they'd rather just not do it at all. And for most white Americans, we simply don't want to acknowledge the reality that black and brown peoples have known for very long in this country, which is that systemic racism is fundamental and foundational to the country. And if you say that in a public school in the state of Tennessee this fall, right, you're going to risk getting fired, I guess. If you say it in Florida, they're going to be able to sue you. I was just in Indiana, same thing, right? If you say what I just said, that systemic racism was fundamental and foundational to this country from its inception, which, by the way, is not an opinion. It's not an opinion. It's not a debatable, rebuttable presumption. It's a fact, and I'm going to prove it to you. It doesn't take a lot of time. If you need proof, I believe in evidence and proof, so I'll give it to you. But people are backlashing against the teaching of that, even if it were just a theory. Even if it were just a perspective, why shouldn't it be heard? I mean, is it just outrageous? Is it like up there with Men from Mars, you know, creating Stonehenge or something? Like, is it just so outrageous that it shouldn't even be heard? Why would you want to shut down a theory? If a theory is bad, just debunk it. If a theory is so outrageous, just explain to me why it's wrong. But none of the folks attacking anti-racist education, what they call critical race theory, ever actually bothered to explain what's wrong with it. They just assume that their outrage is a rebuttal. Indignation is not an argument, right? So racism was foundational to this country. Don't take my word for it. Take the words and the actions of those who were the founders and the initiators of the project known as the United States. Talk about what the very first Congress in this country did after the ratification of the Constitution, right? What's the first thing that Congress did after the Constitution was ratified in terms of legislation? Because you got to assume whatever they did first is their way of saying this is the most important thing, right? Like, that makes sense. You don't do the most important thing like seventh. You do it first, right? So you might think to yourself, well, gosh, I don't know, Tim, maybe the first thing they did was make sure that they had a sufficient army in case the Brits decided to come back and have another run at it. No, that's not what they did. Or you might say, well, maybe they needed to figure out the tax structure so they could figure out how to finance the government. So maybe they did that first. No. They did that, but they didn't do that first. Right? The very first substantive piece of legislation that Congress passed after the Constitution was ratified was a thing called the Naturalization Act of 1790. It's not something we learn about in history class, very many of us in high school. I certainly didn't. And I was in AP history, which they say is the history for the smart kids, right? But they apparently didn't think we were smart enough to handle this truth, even in the 1980s, let alone now with all this backlash happening. What did the Naturalization Act of 1790 say? The first thing that Congress decided to take care of. What did it say? It said that all free white persons and only free white persons could be citizens of the United States. In other words, the most important order of business in the mind of the founders and the first Congress was to make sure that everybody understood, before we dealt with the army, before we dealt with taxes, before we dealt with tariffs, before we dealt with any of the economic stuff, just make sure y'all know that this new thing here is for us and only us. And nobody who is not white will be considered a citizen of the United States. That tells me that white supremacy is there at the birth, right? It, of course, was there before that, really going back to the colonial period. But I'm just saying, in the actual history of the country's laws, it's there from the beginning. Again, not an opinion. There is no rebuttal to what I just said. It happened, and it reads exactly as I say it reads, with the intention that I suggest it had. So then the question is, do we understand what the legacy of that kind of germ of white supremacy is? Do we just assume that doesn't matter, that it doesn't bear fruit? Right? Do we assume that the policies that flowed from that assumption about who could be a citizen and who couldn't, that those policies would create damage perhaps in their own time but not in ours? As if somehow you just flick a switch, you pass a law, and all of the inertia of the past several generations goes away? I mean, inertia, we understand, right? We learn Newton's first law of motion when we're kids in maybe elementary or middle school. I don't know. Depends on where you went to school when you learned it. But certainly usually by middle school, we're learning this concept of inertia. So if I roll a ball down a hill, it's going to keep going till it runs into something, you pick it up, or it meets a certain degree of level ground where the friction ultimately slows it down and stops it, right? We understand that. But inertia isn't just a property of the physical universe. It's a property of the socioeconomic and the political and the cultural universe. That which happens in one generation affects the next and the next and the next, right on down the line. And that's not just about race, that's about everything, y'all. That's about our own family histories, right? You learn that when you go to therapy. I've been in therapy for 4 years. I highly recommend it if you haven't tried it. The thing you learn in therapy is you got to deal with your stuff, and you'll be dealing with your stuff forever. You don't ever stop dealing with it, right? You just try to learn how to manage it and how to figure out where the damage comes from and stop creating the damage in your own life. I mean, that's what you do as an individual. You got to grapple with the past, not just the pretty. Nobody goes to therapy to talk about the pretty, right? You go to therapy to talk about the not so pretty. And if you have to do that as an individual to be healthy, then I know that 330 million of us have to do it collectively to be healthy. That shouldn't be a radical concept, but people are so afraid of it. We'd rather remain in denial, both about our history and the impact that it continues to have on the present. The fact that right now the typical sort of median midpoint white family or household in this country has about 12 times the net worth of the median African-American household, about 10 times that of the median Latino household, about 8 times that of the median indigenous household, depending on which data you're looking at. Right now, the typical white household headed by a high school dropout has more net worth on average than the typical black household headed by a college grad. Think about that. The typical white household headed by someone that didn't even finish high school is higher than the typical net worth of a black household headed by someone who graduated from college, suggesting that racial inequity is not a past problem, but an ongoing problem, and part of it rooted in that past. Because when you have certain groups of people allowed to accumulate wealth over the years and others not allowed to, and then pass that down to their descendants, you will see those wealth disparities. It's not because white folks worked harder. Black folks did some of the hardest work, and brown folks have done some of the hardest work ever done on this land. It's not that white folks have superior investment wisdom. I mean, good Lord, right? I mean, it was not black people that tanked Wall Street in 2008 and 2009, right? It wasn't poor people, wasn't black folks, wasn't brown folks, wasn't undocumented folks, just the whitest, richest, smartest white boys on Wall Street. All of them very bright and gifted, right? Or at least in the eyes of their parents, right? It was the best and brightest that tanked the economy. So white folks aren't smarter with money. That's not why we have more wealth. We're not harder working. That's not why we have more wealth. We had a 5-lap head start and an 8-lap race. And look, here's the way that goes. If you have a 5-lap head start and an 8-lap race, you are supposed to hit the tape first. That is how that works, right? And in fact, if you have a 5-lap, hell, if you just have a 1-lap head start, you should hit the tape first unless you are a slower runner. But here's the problem, right? If you have that head start, the odds are you will cross that tape first, and then we'll pat you on the back for being fast, not acknowledging the social context within which the head start was obtained, right? That's not to say that every white person has the same head start, right? Because whiteness is mediated by other things. It's mediated by socioeconomic status. It's mediated by gender and sex. It's mediated by sexuality and sexual orientation. It's mediated by geographic location of birth. It's mediated by lots of things. There's no one system of privilege. There's multiple ones, right? And every one of us in this room has got some area where we're the privileged group. I guarantee it. So it may not be race, it may not be sex or gender, but it might be being physically able-bodied in a world where disabled folks face real obstacles. That's a privilege, isn't it, to not have to think about that? Right? It might simply be being straight, being cisgendered, having a college degree. Right? I'm 5'8" in a tall man's world. I mean, I'd like to be 6'2", but I'm just not, right? And so people who are 6'2", they have the privilege in that tall man's world in particular of not really knowing what it is to be anything but that. But again, not all these are the same. I'm not saying they're all equal in terms of their social impact. I'm just saying there's multiple ones, right? There's dozens of categories where certain people are the dominant group and other people are subordinate or often marginalized groups. And all we're really saying when we talk about something like white privilege is for us to analogize that and to recognize that when you have any kind of privilege, you have the luxury, don't you, of being oblivious to other people's reality. So that able-bodied person gets to be oblivious to what disabled folks face. It doesn't make that able-bodied person a bigot. It doesn't make that able-bodied person ableist in the oppressive sense of that word, right? It doesn't mean that person is hard-hearted and prejudiced toward people with disabilities. It just means that they have the luxury of not knowing some stuff. And if you're oblivious to things, the odds are you won't know anything about them. Even if you're a really good person who cares deeply, you just have the luxury of not knowing. Everybody's oblivious to something. I'm oblivious to calculus, y'all, because I never took it. And the reason I didn't take it is, thankfully, the Metro Nashville public school system did not require it of me. And if Nashville public schools were not going to make me take calculus, I was not going to volunteer for the abuse. That was for damn sure, right? Just wasn't for me, so I avoided it. Now, if I were to stand up on this stage and try to do calculus for y'all, if you've taken it, you would know in like 5 seconds that I do not know what I am talking about. You'd be like, did he take the class? No, fool, didn't you just listen? I didn't take the class. That's the point. So I shouldn't be trying to talk about it like I know what I'm talking about. But in this country, we do have, don't we, a lot of white folks who think that we know if racism is real better than black and brown folks know if it's real, and we never took the class, metaphorically speaking, you know what I mean, right? They wrote the book. We didn't even take the class, and we trust our own judgment more than them. We have a lot of men running around saying, well, I don't think rape culture is a thing. Oh, okay. I don't think sexism and patriarchy and misogyny are real. But, I've been a man for a long time. I've been a guy for, and white for 53 years. So generally when a guy tells me there's no sexism, I check with women. That's just me, right? I just want a verification. I just need to check with women. And oddly, they virtually never agree. Is that because those men are horrible, awful, mean, nasty people? I mean, some of them are, but most of them are perfectly lovely human beings. But they have the luxury of not knowing what women experience. Straight and cisgendered folks, same thing, right? Able-bodied people, same thing. People who are Christian in a mostly Christian hegemonic society, same thing. We all got some area where we get to be oblivious. But here's the problem. When you're oblivious to other people's reality and you still insist that you know it better than they do, that creates greater conflict. And instead of sitting back and listening and believing when people tell you what their experiences are, you'll argue the point. So when people say there's systemic racism, you'll say there isn't. Even though you haven't done the research, you haven't done the homework, you don't even really know what's being said by it. Sometimes I've heard people say, well, when you say there's systemic racism, Tim, you're just saying all white people are bigots. No, the word system says that that's not what I was talking about, right? I'm not talking about you. Why are you taking it personally? If I said systemic racism, that's not about you at all. You're an individual. We're not talking about individual bigotry. I'm not really interested in how many white people are or are not individually racist. That's fascinating sociological data to compile for certain types of work. It's not what systemic racism is about. Systemic racism is about the way that racial injustice is embedded in the institutional structures of the society, and especially when people are not trying to be bigoted. That's the dirty little secret. Because at least the overt stuff we can see, right? The overt stuff is as horrifying as it is. It's the easiest thing in the world to fight when it comes to racism because everybody can see it. So you see those boys in Charlottesville in 2017, and it's like, oh, Nazis. Okay, well, most of us see that and see Nazis. Apparently some see that and see a handful of good people mixed in with the Nazis, which is weird because if you were a good person at a rally full of Nazis, you would leave, but only after hitting the Nazis. That's what a good person would do. It's what my grandparents' generation had a way of dealing with Nazis. Somehow we seem to have forgotten what that is. I don't know why, but when we see that kind of overt racism, we know it, we can condemn it, and most of us do. I remember back in 1998, I think it was, I was already doing this work and had been for several years. I remember that was the year that a guy named James Byrd, black man in Texas, was dragged behind a truck by two overtly racist Klan members, I believe, or some other white supremacist organization, killed by being dragged behind a truck down a dirt road. And it was a horrible crime. It made a lot of news. It was talked about pretty much every day for weeks, and a big national news story about racism, which it should have been. But what was fascinating is that very same year, 1998, and this data, by the way, is the same still today, roughly. That same year, according to the Centers for Disease Control, there were about 50,000 black folks in this country who died, who would not have died had they had the same access to high-quality health care as white folks. Right? So because of an institutional inequity in access to good health care, 50,000 people died. That didn't make the news. I mean, it did. It was like on page B24 of the New York Times or something, right? small little story that very few people would have seen, wasn't on television, they didn't talk about it, because it's hard to talk about 50,000, isn't it? Hell, it's hard to talk about nearly 1 million dead from COVID, right? Unless you know someone, then you can talk about them. It's always easier to talk about the one person than it is these larger numbers, because they sort of overwhelm us. But the problem is also that it's easier to talk about racism when it's somebody being dragged behind a truck by identifiable hateful people than it is an institutional inequity where there's not a single bigot in the room necessarily, right? Because then you can't identify a bigot, then it's harder to look at because it's harder to distance yourself from it. You can distance yourself from those guys that dragged James Byrd behind the truck. You can distance yourself from those boys in Charlottesville. You can distance yourself from David Duke, and you can say, I'm not like those people. But you're part of a system and a structure that denies equal access to good, high-quality health care, which means we're all implicated in that, and we'd rather not think about it. We just want to divide the world into good people and bad people, but here's the truth. Good people get caught up in bad systems all the time. Policing is actually a really good example of that. There are people who go into law enforcement for all the right reasons. I've known some, right? The problem is if you go into a system that is structured on the basis of domination and control, and specifically domination and control of certain communities, don't be surprised when the system changes the good person more quickly than the good person changes the system. Because when the good person tries to challenge that system, what happens to them? They're the ones who get run out of that institution. Look up Joe Crystal and Michael Wood Jr. These are two white former officers in the Baltimore Police Department, both of whom got into policing for exactly the right reasons. One of them, I can't remember which, I think it was Michael Wood. His parents had both been members of the NYPD, and they both Wood and Crystal, at roughly overlapping times while they were in the Baltimore PD, saw the corruption, saw the brutality, saw police officers planting drugs and weapons on suspects, saw the racism, and they decided to call it out. Because that's not what policing meant to them. And as soon as they called it out, they were the ones who were having dead rats left on their dashboards in their cars or on their desks in the station. They were the ones who, when they would get called out to make a run for a crime that was being committed, and they were the ones who were supposed to respond, they wouldn't send backup for these two guys, right? Just as a way to intimidate them and say, this is what happens when you rat out your fellow officers, right? These were good men trying to do the right thing. You might have seen the video, what was it, like 3 weeks ago? It was going around, viral video. I don't remember what community it was in, but there was a police officer who came upon another officer brutalizing, in the process of brutalizing a man of color, and it was a woman officer came upon a male officer, both of them white, saw the officer brutalizing this guy, tried to get in between and de-escalate the situation. She's trying to do the right thing. The white officer grabs his colleague by the throat and shoves her up against the car because she's trying to de-escalate the situation. So now he's trying to hurt his colleague, and the union came out and defended his actions. Right? That's a system problem, right? Because you can have all the, we talk about good apples and bad apples, man. You can have lots of good apples, but if they're either not willing to stand up to the bad ones, or when they do, they get run out of the orchard, then what good is your fruit analysis? Right? At that point, it just doesn't matter at all, right? These three guys that stood around and watched Derek Chauvin kill George Floyd just got convicted of something today. I didn't have a chance to read the article. I guess failure to provide support. I don't know if they got top-line charges, guilt. But, here are three guys who would say, oh, well, we're good cops. We didn't do that. That was that guy. But if you stand around while other people are doing the deed, then you're part of that problem too. So it isn't about good people and bad people. It's about good people caught up in bad systems, right? You have to change the system. If you go into a sausage factory and stand at the end of the conveyor belt, don't be surprised when it gives you sausage. That's what it was meant to do, right? If you're waiting for the chicken nuggets at the end of the belt, you're going to be sorely disappointed, right? Read the sign on the outside of the bill. It says sausage. It's going to give you sausage. That's what it was programmed to do. If you want different outcomes, you have to change those systems. But those of us in the white community are too often afraid to even acknowledge that there's something to change, and it's been a long-standing problem. Even if you were to go back, this is how you know we're dealing with a sort of pathological denial here. And I'm not saying that white people are incapable of knowing the truth. Like I said, there have always been some who did know. I named some of them, those abolitionists and civil rights folks, and those white folks who are joining the struggle right now clearly have a different viewpoint. But white America writ large has been consistently and persistently in denial. Not just in 2022. That's one thing. I can almost forgive that, right? I get it. You look around in 2022, especially if you're a young person and you See all that old footage from Birmingham in '63, which I realize, first of all, black and white film footage to young people might as well be Moses with stone tablets. I mean, it is incredibly antiquated and hard to imagine that that even is real, right? I don't think they make black and white televisions anymore, right? I mean, this just seems so old school, and so for young people, I'm sure it seems like a million years ago. And so when you look at that, and you think about segregation, and you think about the period of mass lynchings in the early part of the 20th century, and you think about the death of Reconstruction in the 1870s, and you think about enslavement, obviously, before all of that, I guess it's easy to say, well, come on, I mean, compared to that, look how much progress has been made. And that would be disrespectful to the memories of the martyrs of the movement to deny that there has been some progress. I'm not going to deny that. That would disrespect their memories and it would disrespect their struggle. Of course there has been. But the problem is that in every generation, white folks have said that we've made all the progress we need to make. That has been our line consistently. That's not just in 2022. That's not just in 1992 or 1982. That was the same in 1962. Keep in mind, 1962, the civil rights laws hadn't even been passed yet. Civil Rights Act of 64, Voting Rights 65, Fair Housing Act 1968. 1962, the civil rights movement is in full swing. And that year, the Gallup organization asked white Americans, hey, do you think black children have the same chance to get a good education as white children? Now, this is 1962, y'all. This is 8 years after Brown v. Board, but long before any school system had really implemented the strictures of that decision to create equity with all deliberate speed was the term, right? To desegregate the schools and create more equitable schools. They didn't do it equitably, speedy, or anything else, right? 1962, it's an easy question that white America was asked by Gallup. Do you think black children have the same chance to get a good education as white children? The only logical, rational answer is no, and yet 85 out of 100 white people answered yes. Even in 62. In 1963, Gallup came back again, and they asked a different question. They said, do you think that black people are treated, they might have used the term Negro at the time, but they basically said, do you think black folks are treated equally in your community in housing, in employment, and education? So it's a bit broader scope, all three of those areas, and specifically, do you think that they're treated equally in them? And again, it's 1963. The answer is no. The laws haven't been passed. The Civil Rights Act is in full swing. That's the year of the March on Washington. You don't get 225,000 people on the Mall in Washington if everything's cool, if everything's fine, if everything's fair, if everything's equitable, right? Obviously something was wrong, but when Gallup asked white Americans that question, 2 out of 3 white folks, even in 63, said yes, everything is fine. Also in those years, from 1961 all the way through 65, the clear majority, upwards of 75% of white Americans, when asked, do you think that it is proper for black people to continue protesting for their rights and liberties? Upwards of 75% consistently said no, that enough had been done, and it was time for black people to, quote, take advantage of the opportunities they've been given. This is before the laws have even had a chance to either be passed or implemented or have any real effect. And most white folks were already ready to throw in the towel. My guess is if we had had modern polling in the 1920s, the same thing would have been viewed. Well, you know, it was really bad back during the slavery days, but at least we're past that. But then the irony is you can go back to the days of enslavement if we'd had modern polling. You know what would have happened? You know, we didn't have modern polling, but we did have little southern town newspapers where the editorials would always say things like, if these Yankees would just leave us alone and get out of our business, everything would be fine because we get along with everybody down here. Right? One of the most prominent physicians of the 1850s was a guy named Samuel Cartwright. He was a doctor whose theories were taught in medical schools around the country. Very prominent physician, also a defender of slavery. And he came up with the idea of a mental illness that he ascribed to black people who actually ran away from the plantation, because he believed you must be mentally ill to run away from the plantation. Couldn't just be because you want to get the hell out of enslavement. You must be mentally ill. You must have a problem. He came up with this term, a medical term, drapetomania is what he called it. Right? So even in the 1850s, at the height of the most vicious of these forms of racial oppression, you had prominent white people that were like, what? Nothing to see here, y'all. So I guess my question to you is, if white America, by and large, not all white people, clearly, but if white America writ large, in generation after generation after generation, has not seen the problem for what it is, even during periods when it obviously was a problem, and we can all agree on that now looking back in retrospect. What does that tell us about the powers of discernment held by white America writ large? And this isn't a criticism of white people's intelligence or their morality. It is to say that when you don't have to know better, you won't know better because you have the luxury of being oblivious. That isn't a criticism of white people. What it is a criticism of how white supremacy affects the thinking of white folks and makes it hard for us to see what's right in front of us until 50 years later. And then we look back and go, oh my gosh, it was really bad back then, wasn't it? My goodness, that's terrible. My God, look at that, right? But grandma didn't think it was such a big deal. Mom and dad didn't think it was such a big deal, which is probably why they don't want folks seeing those books in third grade and fourth grade and fifth grade. They don't want folks learning about Ruby Bridges trying to go into that school in New Orleans because grandma might have been the one throwing tomatoes at her head. Right? That's the bottom line. You don't really want to talk about the sit-ins in Nashville because might have been your dad or your granddad, right, who was going down there pouring milkshakes and putting cigarettes out on the necks of the protesters. Who knows? You just don't want to find out, do you? So you'd rather not talk about it. But we have to talk about it, and here's why we have to talk about it. This is a piece that often gets left out. A lot of times, even by people in the racial justice movement, it gets left out. So it's not just left out by critics of it, it's left out even by those of us who were in it. And we have to make sure not to do this, right? We have to make it very clear that racial justice work, it's not charity work, right? This is not something white people ought to do for black people or for folks of color more broadly, right? This is not charity work. This is self-help work. What I mean by that is this system of racial inequity is also unhealthy for us. This is not just a black issue, a brown issue, it's a white issue. Just like I would argue that sexism and patriarchy and misogyny are bad for men because they teach us a particular way of being a man, which is, if you haven't noticed, incredibly dysfunctional way of being in the world. Not just for women, but even for ourselves and for the boys that we raise, for those who have sons, right? But racism, too, is incredibly dangerous for us to indulge as white people. We need to be concerned about racial inequity for our own sake as well. What do I mean by that? Let me give you a few examples. So, last couple of days I was in Indiana, and I was speaking in northern Indiana, sort of up near Gary and Hammond, which is not too far from Chicago, an area that in the 60s and the 70s was a huge industrial hub, all kinds of mills and plants operating there, and then in the late 70s and throughout the 80s really got hollowed out by deindustrialization. A lot of the plants closed, companies moved overseas to take advantage of cheaper wages, a lack of labor unions, lack of environmental regulation, et cetera. Same story we hear today continues, right? That started in places like Gary and also places like, Pittsburgh and all throughout what they call the Rust Belt, right? All these sort of large industrial towns in the East and upper Midwest. Starts in the late 70s and early 80s, goes all throughout that decade into the 90s. And for most of that time, what was interesting was the dialogue, the narrative that you heard from a lot of white Americans when people in those communities were hit hard by that job loss. Those are heavily black communities, by the way, right? Disproportionately, places like Gary, disproportionately black. So when those communities were hollowed out by the loss of manufacturing jobs, the people that were hardest hit were black folks, and that's why their unemployment rates were consistently 2 to 3 to 3.5 times higher all throughout that period, right? And a lot of times when white folks would hear about that, there wasn't a lot of sympathy that would attach. People would say things like, well, you just need to move where the jobs are, right? Pull yourself up by your bootstraps and go find a job. If there's no jobs where you live, you should go where there are jobs. And now here we are, 40 years later, and that hollowing out of the industrial base and the manufacturing sector has continued. And now you got a lot of white towns and small towns in Pennsylvania and central PA and in Ohio and all around the country that are closing down. And what do we have those same kinds of communities saying? When are you going to bring the jobs back, politicians? I want you to bring those jobs back to my small dying town. Well, wait a minute. Why don't you just get up and move? Oh, you didn't mean that for you. You meant that for them because you were judging them for not having a job, but now that you lost your job, you got a pink slip at the age of 52, and you don't know what you're going to do with yourself now because nobody's hiring, and you're staring down the barrel of retirement. But isn't it ironic? Because if you cared about deindustrialization when those were the victims, If you hadn't had the luxury, one might say the privilege of ignoring their pain, maybe you'd have done something to ensure that there were job opportunities for those folks, that there were ways to retrain and rehire them for other kinds of jobs. But because we didn't care about that, because it wasn't hurting us, 40 years later it comes back and it bites us on the behind too. See, that's what happens. When you indulge injustice on that side of town, just wait, right? Just wait, it's coming to get you. Think about the opioid crisis. Why is it that we've had such excess death in white, small town, and rural communities among non-college educated working class white people since the late 1990s? Well, obviously one reason is that the pharmaceutical companies pushed a lot of this stuff like Oxy out into the public for profit reasons, so there's that, right, without sufficient regulation. But it's also, right, interesting to note the reaction to the opioid crisis as opposed to the first opioid crisis we had in the 70s, which was a heroin crisis, mostly disproportionately in the cities affecting black folks and brown folks, and then the crack epidemic in the 1980s, disproportionately urban located, affecting black folks and brown folks. What was the rhetoric when it was black and brown folks in the 70s and in the 80s and early 90s? The rhetoric was, we don't need treatment, we don't need rehab, these people are moral reprobates and criminals, and we need to put them in jail. Put them in prison cells, put all the money in locking folks away, 3 strikes you're out, etc., etc., etc. There was no sympathy, there was no empathy, there was no compassion or concern. We treated drug use and drug addiction as a criminal matter, not a public health matter. Then we're surprised that 30 and 40 years later, there's no rehab for little Jimmy John down at the trailer park. There's a reason little Jimmy John can't get rehab, because you didn't put the money into rehab. You have a prison cell waiting for him if you'd like that. That's our only housing program for folks that have an addiction problem, right? So again, the irony is we in the white community had the privilege of ignoring that problem when it was just hitting those folks, and now it's hitting us, right? Once again, you see that privilege tastes really good until it doesn't. It works for you really well until it doesn't. This is an important piece, because sometimes people that talk about white privilege make it sound like it's just all good. It's just win, 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 always winning. But actually, it sets you up for a fall, right? All that winning sets you up because you don't know how to lose now. You understand? When you've been winning all that time, you don't know how to lose. So when that plant closes down, and that wasn't supposed to happen to you. I had a guy write to me several years ago that he'd been unemployed for like 24 weeks, and I guess he was at like a public library reading one of my pieces about white privilege, and he emailed me. He was real angry. He's like, "What white privilege? I've been out of work for 24 weeks. What do you have to say to me?" And first I just said, "Man, I'm terribly sorry, because that is awful, and I can't imagine how hard that must be. Because you got to show compassion. You know, it wouldn't have made any sense for me to say, well, you think you have it bad. Why don't you talk to some black people? Like, that wouldn't have been very nice, right? This guy was clearly hurting. And I said, man, if I knew of any job opportunities that I could throw your way, or anybody, you know, in your field, I'd do it, but I just don't. I said, but if you're willing to engage, I'll give you this piece of analysis, or I don't know, a way to help you think about it. And he said, sure, well, I got nothing else to do today. So I said, well, his name was Jeremy. I said, Jeremy, it's interesting to me that in the email that you sent to me, one of the things you said was, I did everything right. I played by the rules. I worked hard. I kept my nose clean. I worked 50 and 60-hour weeks. I worked on weekends. I didn't take vacations. I barely saw my kids for days at a time. I did everything right. And I said, when you say it like that, right? And then he said, this wasn't supposed to happen to me. That was the infamous line. You didn't say this wasn't supposed to happen, like nobody should be unemployed for 24 weeks. Which I think is true. Like, we ought to have enough job opportunities for people to not be unemployed that long. But he didn't say that, right? What he said was it wasn't supposed to happen to him because he had made all the right moral choices. The implication being all those other poor suckers who were in my position, they didn't play by the rules. So it's okay if it happens to them, but just not me. You see, in other words, Jeremy had been winning so long, he didn't know how to lose. That privilege set him up for a fall. And the minute that things went south in his world, he didn't have the skin that was thick enough to be resilient. Jeremy should have been listening to black people for a few years, and he would have known the system was a scam. If Jeremy had been listening, he would have known the boss didn't love him either, right? He would have known that that plant doesn't love you, that plant loves money. So if that plant wants to close down and move, it's going to close down and move. It doesn't care about your pension. It doesn't care about your children. It doesn't care about your neighborhood. It doesn't care about your marriage. It doesn't care about any of that. It cares about money. And black folks knew it because they'd been living that, right? But sometimes white folks have had the luxury of thinking that the system is exactly as it's been described, and then we're not prepared for the reality. That's what privilege can do to you. Sets you up for a fall. COVID is an excellent example of this. Why do you think the United States has been the epicenter of failure on the planet when it comes to this thing? We got the money. We got this vaccine turned out. I mean, you know, like we did some stuff, right? Pretty impressive. And we're still the epicenter of failure with like 900,000 or whatever the number is now that have died. Why is it still happening? We could make it just about politics and that's the easy way out. But let me say it's deeper than that. Go back to when this thing first became really a national story in March of 2020 when the lockdowns began and we all sort of started paying attention to it. Right. What was really interesting is by the time that happened, we all started masking, we all started distancing, people were taking it pretty seriously. Even the president, who didn't want to mask himself, was telling other people grudgingly to do it. Of course, he thought we'd be back to normal by Easter, so that was incredibly naive. But at least he was saying the right thing, like take this seriously. Tucker Carlson, conservative talk show host, was on TV every night saying, this is real, y'all. This is not the flu. This is not just a cold. You need to take it seriously. There were other talk show hosts that were a lot less concerned than he was, but he was very adamant that it was real. That was in March. April 7th, something interesting happened. The New York Times front page story and the Washington Post front page story that day were about the data on who was doing the disproportionate dying from COVID. And specifically that black folks were, right? That the mortality rates for black folks were like 2.5 times the mortality rates for white folks. That comes out on April 7th of 2020. Now, we all sort of knew that intuitively, but we didn't have it really confirmed until then. And all of a sudden, what happens? Within 2 weeks of that news, you have all these protests at state capitals, white folks showing up with camouflage and semi-automatic weapons, because semi-automatic weapons are known ways to kill, viruses. Right? Showing up with heavy weaponry and camouflage, demanding the right to get back to normal. I want to go back to work. I want to go back to the hair salon. I want to go back to Buffalo Wild Wings. I want to go back to my life the way it was. And by God, this shutdown is wrong. 2 weeks earlier, they weren't saying that. All of a sudden, they're starting to think this isn't going to get them, see? Because the data and the news are telling them it's mostly those people over there. So even if they're not overtly racist or bigoted people, they had the luxury of letting their guard down. The day that New York Times article comes out, that night on Tucker Carlson's show, that night, he goes on and basically says, the most important thing that and he does it just like this because he always furrows his brow exactly like this, like there's some dead animal in front of him that he can't quite figure out what it is. He says, the most important thing is obviously that we need to figure out how to get our people back to work. Literally the day before, he's talking about how deadly and dangerous COVID is, and then the story comes, and maybe this is coincidence, maybe it's a coincidence, but I sort of doubt it. Ray had Brit Hume on as a guest that night, and Brit Hume actually says, it seems like maybe COVID wasn't as deadly as we thought. Well, for whom? Like the story that morning said it was real deadly for these folks in this community. But see, now the white folks were hearing it and saying, well, maybe it's not as big a deal. Then the president comes out and says it's time to open things back up. So we take our foot off the brake, y'all, beginning in April and May, and after that all through the summer. And then what happens? Then we have another explosion. And very interestingly, here's the ironic point. In April of 2020, only about 30% of the deaths from COVID were among white people, like 29 or 30%. The rest were folks of color, black folks, indigenous folks, Latinx folks, right? By December of 2020, 58% of the people dying each month were white. All throughout 2021, that number remained elevated, and now 62% of all the people who have died from COVID in this country are in fact white. So when you take your foot off the brake because you think it's not going to affect you and have the privilege of indulging someone else's pain, you wait around long enough and you're burying grandma. A lot of white folks in this country now that have lost loved ones because we didn't take it seriously enough. And the only thing that I can assume as to why we didn't take it seriously enough is because we didn't see ourselves as the ones who were going to pay the price. Because if we had, we wouldn't have taken that risk. I mean, what do you think? If that article had said that white people were dying at 3 times the rate of black people, do you think those white folks would have been going maskless to the state capitol with guns demanding the right to go back to work? No, man. They would have been at the state capitol demanding the right to stay home in their pajamas and get checks sent to them every week. Right? It isn't just race either. What if that story had said that it was young people rather than older people? Because we don't value older people the same way either, right? You hear that all the time. In the wake of COVID, people would say things like, well, but, you lost a loved one, but they were old, right? They were old. They were like 80, right? And they were sick, right? They had a pre-existing condition, right? Think about what that says. What you're saying is there's a hierarchy of human value, and it's not just that white's up here and black and brown's down here. It's that young is here and old is here, and healthy is here and sick is here. It's social Darwinism applied to the modern era, right? It's just saying, well, but they had a pre-existing, they had asthma, right? So, as if to say that they have asthma because they're like 9 and they smoke, right? Like somehow they brought it on themselves. But that's what we do in this culture. You know why? Because we have been taught something that is at the root of this, and this is where I'll end, and then we'll take some questions. The thing that keeps this going more than anything, it's not bigoted parents teaching their kids bigotry. That happens. But that's not it. Something far more pernicious than that. It's the fundamental, foundational belief of this country's political ideology that we don't interrogate nearly enough. What am I talking about? It's that notion of rugged individualism, right? That notion of meritocracy, that idea that if you work hard, you can make it. Anybody can make it if they just work hard enough. If you believe that, and we've been saying that, we said that back during the period of enslavement, for God's sake. We said it when women couldn't vote. We said it during segregation, so we knew it was, we said it, we knew it wasn't right. Just like when Jefferson said all men are created equal, endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. He owned 200 and something people when he said it, so he didn't mean it. We have this habit of saying stuff that we hadn't really processed and filtered, right? But this idea that all you got to do is work hard and you can make it, that's a race-neutral idea in theory, right? You could have that same mentality in a society where everybody looked alike, quote-unquote racially or ethnically, right, or skin color-wise. But if I tell you that as a child, and that is the cornerstone of the secular gospel. If America were a Bible, that would be Genesis 1:1, right? Anybody can make it if they just work hard. If I tell you that and you come to believe it and then you look around and what do you see? You see white people up here disproportionately, not exclusively, but disproportionately. And you see black and brown folks down here disproportionately, not exclusively, but disproportionately. What do you conclude rationally? How do you process that? Your default position, given the ideology of rugged individualism, tells you that these white people must be in some way superior, or else they wouldn't be there. And these black and brown folks must not want it as badly. They must not try as hard. They must have something wrong with their culture or their family or their genes, right? Racism becomes almost rational if you're not questioning that ideology. By the way, it's not just racism, it does sexism too. If you see men disproportionately up here and women disproportionately down here, you start thinking, well, I guess those women just don't want those careers. They just don't want to work as hard. They're not as smart, whatever, right? Same thing with the class system. Oh, the rich are just that brilliant. Listen, y'all, the top 1% of people in this country in the mid-'70s owned 22% of the financial wealth. Now, even that was pretty good, right? For 1% to own 22% of the paper, so to speak, the financial wealth, is pretty impressive. But now it's 48%. Do we actually think that the wealthiest 1% of Americans, more than doubled their brain power in the last generation and a half? How did they do that? Do they have more than 24 hours in a day that the rest of us have? Jeff Bezos has some type of wormhole that he goes into when he flies up into the air in his the thing he flies into the air in, and he just hides in the wormhole and gets work done when the clock is stopped for the rest of us? No, right? It has nothing to do with work effort. It has to do with the way the economic system benefits some disproportionately to others. But if you've been taught that where you end up is all about your own effort, and you're never really interrogating that, then it becomes really easy to go, oh, inequality, what are you going to do, right? There's nothing you can do about it. And that's the worst thing of all. That's worse. I'd rather have a bigot to deal with than that, right? Because at least the bigot, I know exactly where they're coming from, right? But the one that sort of goes, right? What do you do with that one? That indifference, right? That lack of concern, that assumption of normalcy when we look at inequality. That's the death knell of justice. That ensures that we'll never become the country that we've promised that we intend to become. So we have to fight that, and that's a hard battle, right? That's like going to church on Sunday, 3 rows deep in the pews, and right after the minister finishes preaching, you raise your hand and you hop up on the chair. You're like, that was nice, but there's no God, right? So why are we here? This is sort of silly, right? Nobody responds well to, they don't invite you back to the church when you do that. They don't invite you back to the back room with the cookies and the punch. They just tell you to go, just leave, right? And so when you stand up and question the fundamental core assumptions of the country, don't expect to be patted on the back for it. In fact, they'll tell you that that's un-American. That's subversive. That's what the critics of critical race theory and systemic racism and now say is teaching kids to hate their country. No, we're trying to teach young people to love their country enough to make it what it says it is. Trying to actually subvert those who have subverted justice for far too long, right? Yes, it's revolutionary. Yes, it is subversive. It is trying to overthrow injustice and allow America to become what it said it was so many years ago, but has never actually been. There's nothing that is more patriotic and loving of country than that. There is nothing that is more admirable than that. That is the work that we have to continue, and that those of us who are white in particular have to join, following those leaders of color who have done this work the hard way for 400 years. Too often, without us, we have to join that smaller tradition but meaningful tradition of solidarity and allyship, and I appreciate so much the opportunity to add that voice to your month of incredible events. Thank you all so much for being here. I appreciate you, and I'll take some questions if you have a few of them for me. Thank you. Thank you.
If you have a question, let me know. I have the mic. Steps in.
I'm going to ask you more of an academic question.
Sure.
Are you familiar with the concept of discursive hegemony by Ernesto Laclau and Chantal Mouffe?
You're going to have to describe, I mean, I am, but you're going to need to describe it for me to make sure that I get it right.
It's the idea that a definition by definition is excluding.
Yeah.
So when TJ said all men are created equal,
Yeah.
there's always been an antagonism against that definition,
Yeah.
and those antagonisms have shown up in the civil rights movement,
Yeah.
in abolitionism, and all of that fun stuff. We're having dual antagonisms right now, it seems, to that idea of equality, because, as you said, there's that backlash, the idea that we've done enough. At the same time, for those of us who are on this side,
Yeah.
we recognize that equality has not been reached
Yeah.
on many fronts, not just in race, but in sex and in gender identity, in
Right.
non-gender identity.
Right.
And so I guess my question to you is, how would you rhetorically or discursively package that? Because that's, I think that's, fundamentally, we hear the words, and that's where people freeze up.
Yeah, I mean, there are reasons for that. I think that, first, I would say that I'm a bit skeptical about the power of discourse alone to change people's thinking. It's important. Narrative is important. Storytelling is incredibly important. I would say storytelling is more important than the academic analysis and the words that we use. Like, I don't get tripped up, for instance, about certain words. If people want to choose other words to describe certain things because they think they're more pedagogically effective, then they can do that. I think the important thing is really two things that are critical. One is the power of stories that describe the reality that we're trying to approach. Now, tonight, I did it a little more analytically and politically. I told a few stories, but in my book, White Like Me, my memoir, I make all these same points about privilege without any data, without any scholarly analysis, simply with personal stories. And my guess is many of us have those stories, including many white folks who have stories that demonstrate privilege in all of its different facets and its complications. And I think the discursive strategy for pushing back on the critique of equity is a storytelling strategy more than an analytical, academic, intellectual strategy. Because what we know from neuroscience and the research on brain science research is that people respond far better to stories than they do facts, because they will always sort of find way. In fact, what we know is the more facts you give and the stronger analysis you give that counter someone's preconceived notions, the more they double down on their first thought, right? And there's a lot of reasons for that are evolutionary in nature in some ways, and makes it really hard to break through. So I think we want to ramp up the storytelling, especially in small group settings where we're dealing with people in classrooms, we're dealing with people in churches and nonprofit organizations and community organizations, where we really have the opportunity to delve deeply into some of this stuff. And the second thing is you have to actually engage in praxis and action, right? So it's very important that we're out in the community meeting people and forging relationships, because, it's funny, whenever I do a Zoom call, and I've obviously done, like so many people, a lot of them in the last couple of years since COVID, I have this bookshelf behind me in my office that has all my books on it, and I'd like to tell you that I've read all those books. I have not. I've read a lot of them, and I know where they are if I need them or if my kids need them for a research paper. But I haven't read them all. But the point is, even if I had, that would not be the source of what I do. I don't do what I do because of some really great class I took in college, although I took several on this subject. I don't do what I do because of some amazing book or film, documentary, YouTube clip, whatever, right? Those have helped, and they inform me, and I know they inform others. But I think if we really want long-term commitment to pushing back and changing this thing, we have to have real relationship. And I say this as someone who for many years was somewhat skeptical of this, because I would always hear people who I didn't think had a very radical political analysis talk about the importance of, personal connections and heart work and all that. And I always felt that was very apolitical. But then I actually reflected on my own history, and I realized how critical that had been. Yes, it's true that friendship and connection is not enough. Right, we know every white person says they got black friends, and we're usually lying. I mean, so we know that is a trope that white folks have used for many generations when we want to get out of the conversation. But just because friendship and connection isn't sufficient doesn't mean it isn't necessary. Because when I think about why I do what I do, it's not those books behind me on my Zoom calls. It's not the classes that I took. It's the fact that when I was 11 years old, I was on a baseball team in Nashville with only three other white kids. Everybody else on the team is black. And we went out to play a scrimmage about 30, 40 minutes outside in an ex-urban, rural, small-town community. And when we showed up, the team wouldn't play us because they didn't want to play against a black team. So they surrounded our car as we were about to leave, and they were screaming the N-word at the black kids, and they were screaming N-word lover at the white kids and the coach. Right? I was 11. This is 1980. This is not 1950. Right? And that's why. That and other examples like that, because that day, not only did I see what my friends, what people I had an investment in, people I loved and cared for, right, what they were experiencing at the hands of another person, but I also saw those other white kids drawing a line in the sand and telling me that I'd crossed over, right? They put me on that side. I'd now been excluded from the welcome table, as James Baldwin put it. And so if we have those experiences, if we can create opportunities for our children and for our families and for ourselves to really get to know folks, and have a personal investment in the well-being of other human beings who are different than ourselves, and it becomes a lot easier to go forward and to do this work in a way that isn't relying on discourse and scholarship and analysis per se, but is rooted in a real deep personal level understanding of what needs to be done. So I don't think there's any way to package it per se, and I'm suspicious of any packet. It's like I remember I was on this is going to sound like a made-up story, but it's true. I was on a cruise where I was invited to come on a cruise to give a talk about white privilege, which I'm totally not making that up. It was an idea cruise. It was sort of like a TED Talk in the sea kind of thing, but still, like when they called me and they're like, "Do you want to go on a cruise ship and talk about white privilege?" I'm like, "Yeah." Like, but it's not even like a talk. Like all I have to, it's just performance art. Like I'm going to go grab shrimp off the buffet. I'm going to stand up at the podium. I'm going to go, "There, the speech is over." Like we just talked about, we're on a boat in the middle of the ocean talking about white privilege. But I gave the talk, and afterward, these very well-meaning, completely earnest, and entirely aggravating people from Silicon Valley, a lot of tech people were on the boat. There's there was a bunch. There was like, it was weird. It was like Patrisse Cullors from BLM, and then me and a bunch of activists and progressive media people, and then all these tech bros from the Valley. It was weird. But the tech bros were at my thing, and they were like, they're thinking, their wheels are spinning the way that their wheels spin. So they come up to me afterward, and they're like, "I think I've got an idea for an app that can track white privilege." And I was both fascinated and horrified, right? By they're like, no, really, I've got an idea and I'm coding it right now, and it's going to be an app that'll give you like a privilege score, and I'm just like, bro, get back to me, and just like, you got to do a little bit more work. Talk to me later, But so I think there's like a way to package discourse that probably would be better than that. But I think the whole concept of packaging it is we're never going to be as good at marketing in that strict sense as the people for whom marketing was created, which are the people who are trying to manipulate you, usually for reasons that are not in your best interest. So I think we have to play the long game that we're better at, which I think I think the storytelling and I think the actual making of human connection is a strength for progressive people and for people who believe in justice and equity, and I think we want to play to our strengths whenever possible, for sure. Yeah, other questions?
Any other questions?
Okay.
Char, wait, Char.
But I'm in a media department.
Okay.
So I find myself kind of on the outside even of my own department because I'm a word person.
Right.
So because marketing was developed for not necessarily progressive ideas.
Right.
I find that in the movement it's easier for that backlash to be packaged.
Yeah, it is.
It's much harder to harness the energy
Right.
for a long term.
Yeah.
It's very cyclical.
Right.
So what strategies would you put forward to maintain the energy? Because
Yeah.
even now you see it ebbing.
Yeah.
Even though we had the verdict yesterday
Yeah.
in Georgia, which was
Yeah.
affirming in many ways, but now there's going to be that whole idea. Okay, well,
Sure.
we've got this, so
Sure.
how do you keep the energy going?
I think the only way that you do it is the only way that I've done it personally. Again, this is a personal story thing, right? And so for me, it's like, how do you keep a movement from burning out is the same way that you keep individuals in that movement from burning out. The same strategies apply, just on a broader collective scale. And I can tell you that for me, what keeps me from burning out and becoming despondent is both a recognition of the historical arc that we're involved in, that this is a very long-term process, and being able to let go a little bit. I mean, it's actually an insight from critical race theory, a couple of insights from critical race theory, right? Derek Bell, who's the founder essentially of critical race theory, the father of it, now passed, of course, but Professor Bell's argument had two very important insights that he added to this conversation. He had more than that, but these two were pertinent to your question. One was that Derek Bell said in Faces at the Bottom of the Well, which came out, I think, in 93 or 94, that racism was likely to be a permanent feature of American life, that it would probably never be fully conquered and defeated. And when he said that, as a black man in America, there were a lot of folks, including black folks, who were very upset at him for saying it. Like, how can you be so skeptical and pessimistic, and aren't you just sort of, pissing on the graves of the martyrs of the movement, that kind of thing, and isn't that wrong? And then there were a lot of white folks who were upset. How dare you? Because, white folks have been told we can do anything that we want, including ending racism, by God, so how dare you tell us that we can't? And Derek Bell was just saying, I'm not saying give up the struggle. In fact, I'm saying you'll be better in the struggle if you take a realistic assessment of the fact that it probably isn't going to change, certainly not entirely, and definitely not in your lifetime. Once you let go of that, it liberates you, right? It liberates you to say, okay, what can I do today? And then what can I do tomorrow? As opposed to always looking to see where the finish line is. Because when you're looking to see where the finish line is and you're really wanting to cross it so you can go on a vacation or something, like do something else, you're always frustrated because the finish line keeps getting further and further away. The odds that anyone in this room today is going to be of the generation that finally ushers out this system that all these other amazing people weren't able to destroy over all these generations, those odds are very long. And so what? So what if we knew that it was never going to end? Does that relieve us of the obligation to try? Of course not. James Baldwin talked about this as well. He said that we have an obligation as humans on this planet to earn our death. I want you to think about what that means. Earn your death, right? By the way that you confront the conundrums of life is what he was talking about. You earn the right to leave this place when you actually show that you deserve to be here in the first place. And how do you show that? By doing something that only humans do, which is organize for collective liberation. That's a uniquely human thing, right? So uniquely human that even the animal rights movement had to be organized by people. That's how unique it is. Like the mink couldn't do it themselves, right? The lab animals couldn't do it themselves. Like humans had to do, that's a unique thing. So who in the world are we not to do the one thing that makes us human? So to me, if you take that viewpoint, you don't get as burned out, you don't get as cynical. It seems like a cynical argument, but it actually fights against cynicism. The second insight of Bell's was this notion of interest convergence that, again, people get very upset about, but essentially what Professor Bell said is, look, America's never really made moves for black folks unless it also was in the interest of white people. That's just the truth. And so let's work with that truth. Right? He said, for instance, Brown v. Board wasn't decided because the Supreme Court woke up and said, oh my God, look at all this segregation we've been tolerating. Right? That's why it was an 8-0 decision with one sitting out the decision, abstaining from it. Those were not the most enlightened jurists at the time, but they did the right thing. Why? Because we were in the middle of a Cold War with the Soviet Union, and the fight against colonialism was heating up in Africa and in Asia and in Latin America. So when you are in the middle of a propaganda campaign battle against your sworn enemy, the Soviet Union, and you've got all these brown nations around the world that are going to be coming out from under the boot of oppression, looking around to see a model that they should choose, you really don't want your model to be the one where the boot is on the neck of the brown person, right? So for purely propagandistic reasons, you want to put on a better face. And so the civil rights movement wins a lot of its victories, not just because of the genius of its organizers, although that was important, not just because of the genius of the narrative of King and others, but because the timing was perfect. The timing was perfect because there was a value in getting greater equity that would serve white folks as well. And my argument would be in the present, if you want to push back on this stuff, we need to find the points of interest convergence now as well. Even though it's unfortunate that it takes that, we got to deal with what's real, not what we prefer. It'd be nice if everybody would fight racism because it's an evil system. Right? It would be nice if everyone would do the right thing for the right reasons. But I'm cool with people doing the right thing for the wrong reasons or for any reason if they'll just do the right thing. And so if that's about not having to bury grandma from COVID because you take it seriously in the first 3 months, then we'll do that. If that's about not having an opioid crisis that's ravaging and killing tens of thousands of white folks in excess of what it would otherwise do because we had the war on drugs rather than rehab and treatment, then that's what we'll do. Right? And so when we start finding those areas of interest convergence, I think we can go to white folks and say, look, who benefits from all this division? Who benefits from all this rhetoric about from not talking about racism? Is that going to improve your life at all? Is that going to make your life any better? I mean, that's been the trick, that whiteness has done for 400 years since it was essentially created in the colonial era as a concept. It was always about rich people who were now called white, telling poor people now called white that their enemies were black and brown. It's page 1 of the playbook of American politics, and it hasn't served the interest of a single poor white person yet, right? And so I think as long as we can have that kind of conversation, we can do an end run around some of this culture war rhetoric of the right by just saying, like, who benefits from this, and why? And it's always about asking questions. Why are these people attacking this now? Why are they upset about this now? What is the relationship between this attack on anti-racist thought and the uprising of 2 years ago? Is that a coincidence, or do you think there's something to that? And I think the more that we ask those kinds of probing questions and the more that we tell our own stories, the better we can push back. But it's going to take all kinds of strategies, obviously, to do it. Yes, back there.
Is this?
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought we were there.
Go ahead,
We're
Evelyn.
here and then there. Okay.
Oh, sorry. I have some questions that may seem a little bit off topic, but they lead up to an
all good.
on-topic question. Have you seen The Lord of the Rings?
I hate to admit that I haven't, but it's like when somebody asks me if I've seen Star Wars. I'm like the only person who's only seen the first one.
Okay.
Okay, there you go. You haven't either. Good. No, I haven't seen, but I know the story. I know the story a little bit, so go ahead. Yeah.
So Lord of the Rings, they're coming out with a new series, which is The Rings of Power.
Right.
And they've cast some people of color as characters that were potentially not originally supposed to be
Yeah.
of color.
Yeah.
And so there's kind of this accusation of wokeness
Yeah.
that's been going around, especially on some of the internet forums that I am a
Sure,
part of.
sure.
I was wondering what you would recommend that I respond to that kind of accusation with, because it's really frustrating because I don't know that I have the grasp of the rhetoric in order to explain to them like
Right.
why their accusation is wrong.
Well, I just find it fascinating when people take an entirely fictional story about entirely fictional beings in an entirely fictional world and assume that they're supposed to be white, right? Which is the assumption here. Like, why do you, it's like, now this is maybe an even more extreme example, but it's part of the same thing. When they cast The Little Mermaid in the real action version, live action version of Little Mermaid as a black woman, as a black girl playing that role, people lost their mind. Well, Ariel is white. No, Ariel is a mermaid, yo. Ariel is not real. Ariel is a mermaid with a fin who lives in the water. Like, this is not, why does she have to, I mean, she's not a girl. She's not a redhead. She's not from Ireland. Like what, she is a mermaid. Why can't she be black, right? Or like when they made Rue in the Hunger Games black. And interestingly, Rue was black in the book too. Folks just weren't paying attention. And that's what the actual writer came out and said, did y'all not get that? Like, I didn't make it obvious, but the way I was describing the community, the way I was describing even some of the references to skin color, like, you should have picked up on it. Everybody just assumed Rue was white. And then when Rue was black, it's like, oh, how can you do that? Or how can you recast this person as white? Or that, how can Annie be black? How can Annie the orphan? This is not what Daddy Warbucks is not real. This is not a real story. This could be anybody. Who cares, right? I mean, and look, as soon as these folks will answer why they made Jesus white, then we can have the conversation about why all these fantasy characters are black or brown. Like, you took a dude from the Middle East who's a first century Palestinian Jew, which is essentially North Africa. If you look at the map, right? We don't like to think of the Middle East as North Africa. We prefer to call it Asia Minor, and I think I know why, right? But you took a dude who's a first generation Palestinian Jew and made him look like he is from Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, right? And then you're worried about Rue, and you're worried about the Little Mermaid, and you're worried about the characters in Lord of the Rings. I mean, I think it just suggests to me that we've got a default, and it doesn't make us bad people. Look, when I read The Hunger Games, I didn't pick up on Rue being black either necessarily. I did picture a white child. Now, it didn't bother me when it was a black actress playing her. I was like, oh, that's cool. And then when the author came out and said that, I'm like, wow, that's fascinating. I wonder why even I thought that. So it's a natural thing to sort of assume when you're reading a book or you're thinking about a movie, like, I've always envisioned these characters in this particular way. And I'll admit it's a little weird when you watch like Bridgerton and you see all these black folks in these like really prominent, but like, this is not really what this community would have looked like. Or like my wife is watching, what is it? The thing about Catherine the Great. It's a series also, I think, on Netflix, or called The Great, right? And there's like black people in like, 1700s Russia or something. Like, I mean, like, I don't really think this is accurate, but I mean, but it's not enough to get flipped up about. Like, who cares? Just watch the program. It's a fantasy, right? It's a fiction. If they were to cast like, Albert Einstein as an Asian dude, that might be weird or something, but because that's a real guy. Like, but these are fictional characters, fantasy characters. It seems a little bizarre to me, for sure. Right. Yeah.
Ricky, did you want to ask your question? All right, y'all. Nope, I lied. Nope, coming now. It's okay. It gets.
There's not a student that has one.
My question is a filler question. But it's okay, I was going to ask you. First of all, that was a great presentation, and I wish I could lecture like that. And if I did, I'd probably get a lot more out of my students. So that was really awesome.
Thank you.
But the question I have is, and this is not such a big issue here at the university because, there's certain intellectual rules around knowledge here, but do you have any thoughts or any advice on this kind of climate we're living in now where any evidence to the contrary becomes just dismissible as fake news or just fake or just manufactured? I mean, we're living in a world now where the intellectual relativism is at such an extreme that you can just dismiss anything by saying it's not real. Or it's a conspiracy, or you're making this up, or you're liberal, or whatever. I mean, how do you even engage in conversations with people in that context?
Well, sometimes you just can't, and the reality is that I've learned over the years that you can't save everybody. I think the great the great downfall of liberal and progressive-minded people is that we have this unnatural, completely unhealthy, and unrealistic faith in the power of pure reason. And we sort of assume that if you present evidence to people that it'll work. And the reality is that's not even really how we came to our views. If we're really honest and humble, radically humble, we have to acknowledge that we all have preconceived notions. And we might have picked those up in our homes. We might have picked those up from our experiences. And once we have our preconceived beliefs and notions, we look very hard for evidence that confirms them. And we all do this. We engage in epistemic closure. We engage in selection bias, and so confirmation bias. And so if we can be honest enough to admit that about ourselves, then we can have conversations with other people that are not so much about judging them for their beliefs and trying to push ours on them, but saying, hey, let's have a discussion about why you think what you think, not what you think. So for instance, a couple years ago, I was asked by, I can't remember the school, they really badly wanted me to come in and debate Ben Shapiro, and I said, I'm not going to debate Ben. I've done that before in an online forum, and it was just ridiculous. I said, but I'm not going to do it because I've done these debates before, and when you do these debates, I debated Dinesh D'Souza 8 times. I debate all these right-wing people, and every time it basically becomes a big pissing contest where I bring, my crew comes in on this side of the room, their crew's on that side of the room, and everybody leaves in the same crew. Nobody changes their mind or opens their mind or really listens. They're just looking for the applause lines, right? Or the funny bits that, and I'll give them to them, and then they'll go out and they'll be happy, and these other people be angry and whatever. I did say, though, hey, if you want Ben and I to have a conversation about why we think what we think, I would engage in a dialogue about that. But the rules of that conversation would be that you cannot make any fact-based arguments at all about the subject that we're going to discuss. All you're going to talk about is why the facts that you've seen have been convincing and why for me they're not, and vice versa. Because clearly, Ben Shapiro and I could look at, and any other person on the right, we could look at the same information and come to very different conclusions. There are reasons for that, and the reasons are not, well, I'm smart and he's stupid, or he's smart and I'm stupid. The reasons for that are usually based on life experience, right? So the reason that I know white privilege is a thing is not, again, because of the books and the classes and the analysis. It's because I witnessed it over and over in my own life. And my guess is Ben Shapiro's had a life where he didn't have that confrontation with that truth in the same way. Right? So that would be an interesting conversation, because that doesn't mean that I'm looking at him and saying, you're a jackass and a fool and an idiot for not knowing what I know. It's just like, oh, do you see what this means, Ben? This means that you're coming at it from a particular frame of reference, which makes perfect sense for you, and I'm coming at it from here. And guess what? Those black and brown folks that have been trying to tell us both the truth, they're coming at it from their experience. So let's have that conversation, because I feel like if we can engage in that level of radical humility, that person that we're then presenting our viewpoint to, maybe in the second round of go around. Maybe the first round is that why, and the second and third round is the what. And by the time we get to the what, they don't feel they're being preached at. They don't feel they're being looked down upon, right? They don't feel they're being judged for their view. They feel like there's actually a conversation happening. A couple years ago, I was speaking right before Thanksgiving. This always happens when it's right before Thanksgiving. I'll go somewhere and students will say, look, Thanksgiving's coming up and I'm going home and I've got this uncle and oh God, it's going to be terrible. And he's coming over. It's always an uncle. It's never an aunt. And it's never the dad. It's always the dad's awful brother, which I find fascinating. But anyway, the uncle's coming and he's going to do something terrible. And what do I say? And I said, well, the first thing you do, let me tell you what you don't do. First thing is you do not break out your Intersectional Feminist 101 class book, textbook from class. Not because it's not good. It's good stuff, and your uncle probably could benefit from reading it, but Thanksgiving is not the time. And the last thing that a 50-year-old man wants to hear from anybody who is 19 is what they're learning up at the college, right? So in a sense, just to be honest, like nobody wants to be told that if they didn't also go up at the college. So I would say do not do any of that. What you should do instead is, and when your uncle starts in or says something, ask that person, uncle, friend, colleague, student in class, tell me why you believe what you believe. Don't tell me what you believe. I know, I get it, but why? Why do you find that convincing? Because what I've learned in my experience is that when you ask someone to really reflect on the why piece, they themselves, after a few minutes, will start to come to a realization that they don't have a really great answer for that one. They're confident about what they think they know, but when they're actually asked to articulate why they know it as opposed to just think it, they really don't, they can't really explain it to you. But because you've asked them, you've shown a degree of interest in them, you've shown a certain degree of compassion, you're letting them have a chance to explain so they don't feel judged, they don't feel attacked. And because you've asked them, they sometimes will then usually feel the need to reciprocate, right? Like if I ask you, well, why do you think what you think? Then you're going to listen to me when I explain why I think what I think. And now we're actually having a conversation that isn't rooted in judgment or you're fake or no, you're fake or I'm smart, no, you're smart. No, it's much more about, hey, isn't it interesting that we can look at the same information and see the world so incredibly differently? What is that about? Let's talk about that. Because if we can have that, at the very least, the benefit is this. It may not change people's minds. In fact, my guess is that political change is one at the margins. It's not one with massive conversions of people one way or the other, particularly on issues where there's deep psychological attachment to one's position. And I think issues of race and sex and sexuality and gender and religion all fall into that category. So the movement there is going to be very minimal. I think winning is really about mobilization at that point. I think it's about we just have to out-organize the other side. It isn't really about flipping their people. It's about protecting our people from being flipped, inoculating people from being flipped, and then just out organizing and beating them. But having said that, at the very least, if we take this rhetorical approach of questioning and humility and acknowledging our own biases, acknowledging, hey, you know what, I could be wrong, but I'm just telling you what I've seen. The reason I wrote White Like Me the way that I wrote it as a memoir, I just wanted to tell stories and not necessarily beat you over the head with what it means. Like I'll tell you a story about this encounter with cops that I had, where I was clearly let off in ways I would not have been had I been a person of color. You tell me what it means. I think I know what it means, and I think you can probably tell where I'm going with it, but you tell, if it's not what I think it is and what these other students in the room think it is, you tell me what you think it is. And that's a passive approach that allows people to feel non-judgmental relationship between themselves and a professor or themselves and a colleague or a friend or a family member. And I think at the very least what that gets us, even if it doesn't flip people's thinking, is it brings down the heat and the temperature in these conversations, and that alone allows openings for other approaches that might bring about change, or at the very least, it reduces the danger level. Because right now, we're at an incredibly dangerous place where the narrative and the rhetoric and the discourse are at such an amped up level that people are going to get hurt. They're already getting hurt. And so we need to bring down that volume considerably unless we want this thing to explode. So if that's all that does, there's value in it. And I think it can probably accomplish more than that, but at least that. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. Let's all thank Mr. Wise for his time.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'll be really quick because I know everybody wants to get home to their everything. Mr. Wise will be signing his book if you want